All right, hey guys, welcome to the Friday night study through the book of Romans, verse by verse. We are going through Romans, the book of Romans, all the way through in our Friday night study, verse by verse, chapter by chapter. Uh, the book of Romans, and one of my favorite books. Like I say, I know I often say that all the time, that Romans is one of my favorite books. I mean, a lot of books are my favorite books. But anyway, I'll put it in context. Romans is one of my favorite books because of its teaching on its explicit, plain teaching on the subject of salvation. And um, that's what makes, I mean, that's just when we are through with Romans, okay? When we are through with Romans, you would have you will have a thorough understanding, an assured understanding of salvation. That you will know that you know that you know that you know that you know uh, that you are saved and why you are saved. Now, I say this before, when you, I used this illustration before, that if I go to a box store and I go to a box store, I buy a 80-inch plasma TV. So I take the box, I take it to the cash register. Let's say I go to the self checkout, ring it up, I pay for it, and then I get my receipt. Now I always get my receipt. And then I proceed to take the exit. Now, some of these box stores, and you'll know which ones I'm talking about, that they're going to have someone that is going to be standing at the exit, and they're going to ask for your receipt. Now, I said this before, I never show my receipt. I just don't. Unless you are in a membership, one of those membership stores, there is absolutely no legal obligation for you to show the receipt. They ask for it, but you could say, no, I'm just not going to show it to you. Now, let's say if you get an overzealous person that comes along and wants to make an issue out of it, and they said, well, we want to, you have to show, you have to show your receipt. No, let me tell you why. See, the TV, once I pay for it, once the transaction is complete and I pay for it, it's my TV. You don't have a right to my TV. Now, I can, you know why I'm so bold? Because I got a receipt. That's what I told you, I always keep your receipt. But I have a receipt. Now, I'm making the analogy of our salvation because, one, you look at me purchasing that TV, you look at me purchasing that TV. So there's a couple of things about that. So let's look at our salvation from a vital side. The vital side is it's mine, but I'm not enjoying it, right? Because it's still boxed up. And so when I get home, I unbox it, put it together, plug it in. Now I'm living it. I'm experiencing it. Now our salvation right now, we live by faith, and we'll probably get into it more about the fact that right now we are saved at this moment. What Romans is going to teach us is the legal side of our salvation. Now, remember the legal side, when I go back to my illustration about the TV, see, legally I own it. Now, it's not hung up on my walls, and I'm not, going with the remote, but I legally own it. Let's say if I put that box in my car, and let's say I don't open it for another month or let's say if I don't open it for another year, it's still my TV. I legally have it. So if anybody ever asks me, so let's say if I'm riding around with the TV and the police stop me, and let me see something here. Oh, here we go. If the police stops me and they say, "What are you doing with that TV in the backseat of your car?" None of your business, because it's my TV. And again, there's a whole bunch of legal stuff that I can get into, you know. But my point is this. So the legal side, and as long as I have my receipt, that's why I say it's important to keep the receipt. Romans is going to give us the receipt of our salvation. Now, we have been going through and talking about man's status, and this is important to understand. Why do we need to be saved? Why do we need to be saved? Right? And that's a good question. And by the way, it's a question that we need to answer more than you think, because religion, when we talk about man's religion, man's religion, every denomination, every Christian denomination falls under man-made religion. Every one of them, every man-made religion, okay? I mean, denominations. And they are individually marked by their doctrine, and usually their doctrine of how they define how you are saved. So if you are a Catholic, excuse me, if you are a Catholic, you have the Catholic way of salvation. How the Catholics say, this is how you get into heaven. The Catholics, okay? And so, if you are a Baptist, you have the Baptist way. Calvinism, primarily. If you are other kind of religions, they may tell you, you have to be baptized in water, right? You have to be baptized in water, and you have to be baptized in water. Okay. Oh. You have to be baptized in water, and okay, you have to be baptized in water. Getting my things here together here, but you have to be baptized in water in order to get into heaven. So that's man-made religion. Now, all of that, and I'll get to it. All of that then comes to this. All of that comes to this. Every debate that I had on whether it's once saved, always saved, whether it's water baptism, Calvinism, Pentecostal holiness. That Pentecostal holiness, people say that you have to live right in order to get to heaven. See, in other words, all of the man-made religions are man's effort, human effort to be right with God, human effort how to get to heaven. Which means this: you are not truly saved right now. Right? You're not truly saved. See, and one of my things I always ask is, if we're not, if right now, what is your status? Now go back to my illustration of me purchasing the TV. See, I own the TV. It's mine. It's not like it's not like some of you are way too young for this. But back in the, let's say 80s, whatever. Put it like this. There was a time when a lot of stores would have what they call layaway. And what the layaway was is, let's say you wanted a suit, right? And let's say several suits, but you didn't have enough money to buy all of those several suits. Okay, so you would take those suits to the layaway department, and then I think you had to put maybe a down payment on it, and then they would put it away for you, and then you either would make payments or you make payments up to a certain point. Okay, all right. So now, but if you didn't pay, then the store would just put it back on the shelf. So in reality, it really wasn't yours. You were paying on it. You were paying on those suits, but they wasn't really yours. You couldn't wear them, right? You couldn't take them out and wear them. So the reality is that you never really own the suits. Now I'm gonna transition on to where we want to get into tonight, but I want to play a clip again. And this is a clip that I came across with Pastor Marvin Sapp. And the reason why I'm playing this clip because and just really, this is a very, very short video clip, but he says something that it just, I don't know why, but it surprised me that a man after, I want to say 40 years plus of preaching, that this is what he's going to preach. So let me play it and then we'll come back.
I am not perfect. I am progressing. None of you will know if you really saved until you take your last breath.
Okay, so that astounded me because there's two things what he said. He says, I am progressing. And then he said, none of you will know that you are truly saved until you take your last breath. That is so unbiblical, and this is what we're going to get into. That's a problem because basically what he is saying is that he's not saved, or at least he doesn't know. And then when he says we're progressing, his hope, which is a false hope, is that he's going to live a certain way. He's going to do enough good works that's going to hopefully earn his way to heaven. And that's a sad spiritual state to be in. That's sad, unfortunately. And I guess I'm not just picking on Pastor Sapp. That is represented throughout Christianity. See, throughout Christianity, that's represented. That's how most people think. So let's jump to it. Romans chapter 3. Now again, I'm gonna go back to, I want to start reading just so we can have it fresh in our minds. In verse 9, he says, what then, are we any better? Not at all, for we have previously charged both Jews and Gentiles are all under sin. So right here, this is our starting point. We are all under sin. As it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. Now, what is interesting about Pastor Sapp's statement, remember, he said he's progressing. And the reason we spent, again, a few weeks on defining what sin is, his statement, I'm progressing, doesn't meet God's standard. You may think you're progressing, but this is what God thinks about you. This is what God thinks about us. There's none righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands, and there is no one who seeks God. All have turned away. All alike have become useless. Remember, he said he's progressing. Useless. There is no one who does what is good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave. They deceive with their tongues. Vernon, vipers, vernon is under their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin, ruin and wretchedness are in their path, and the paths of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. So this is where, again, this is the state of every single human being. Remember, he says, all, now get this, are under sin. And so what we have been defining, what does God think about sin? So we know we have our opinions what we think about sin. What we need to look at is what God thinks about sin. How does God think about my? See, I could tell God, this is what I think. I'm not as bad. Let's just say, for example, if I was to stand before the judgment seat of God, for all eternity, and I say, well, God, I can give you a whole list of stuff that what I didn't do. I never committed murder, right? I didn't fraudulently steal millions from people. And I could go on with the list, right? But notice what he says right here. You start with this. You already start with God thinks you're useless. God thinks no one is righteous. No one does good. All right. So now let's move on in verse 19, because this is, what I'm going to do is also, I'm going to define terms. Now, why do I do that? It's kind of funny because I have been having this debate on water baptism. I have it all the time. And people, again, in typical fashion, of course, make their arguments. They cherry pick verses in which they will say, they will cherry pick verses in which, okay, they're going to say why you have to have that water. You have to have that, the physical properties of H2O, and they're going to tell you that if you don't have them, you're not going to heaven. Okay, but they never answer, like, as these what we're going to get into, these verses of scriptures. Then what actually saves? Like, if Pastor Sapp is correct, if Pastor is correct, then when do we get saved? All right, let's go on. Now, verse 19 says, now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are subject to the law. Now, by the way, everyone is subject to the law of God. So let's define the term law. Let's define the term law. So let's do this. We're gonna kind of break this down into a simple Bible study here. Here we go. I'm gonna break this down. Come on. All right. By the way, what you're seeing online here is the W Vines. And up here you can see that. Vines. Let me come out here for a moment because I want you to kind of see this, what words mean, okay? What words mean. So, as you know, our English language, our English translation of the scriptures, okay? So if you speak English, if you read the Bible from an English translation, it's English, it's not Greek. The words come from the Greek. Now, if you know, I don't get a lot into the Greek. I don't get into Greek. I don't get into defining Greek words. I'm going to do this only from a standpoint of understanding here, so that when you hear the term law, what is being meant right here. So here is what I was trying to show you. W.D. Vine's Greek words. Okay, so that's what we're looking up there. I have another one right here. It's a book one, big one. Thucydides word study, Greek words, and basically they kind of use the same. They use the same number. This baby here, old school, as you can see my duct tape on it, Strong Concordance. Now the reason why I'm kind of showing you this is because they use a number system. Okay, if you look up in here, you'll see their number. It corresponds with the Strongs. Okay, so 3 different Greek letters. Okay, so that's what we're doing. I'm just simply going to show you, define what is meant by words. So with that, let's look at our first word, law. I could tell you, but I want to be a little more different and just say, let's take a look at what law is. Here we go. Okay, so the first thing, law, and then, now I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time with these words because, again, reading definitions could be tedious. I'm just going to put it that way. I just want to get the gist here. So the first thing is, he says, akin to, divide out, distribute, primarily meant that which is assigned, hence use custom, and thence law. Law as prescribed by customs or by statutes. The word ethos, customs, was retained for the unwritten law. And then, as you can see here, the law in general. Now, this goes to this Greek word. Remember, I was telling you about the numbers here. If you see that term, that's what I mean. That corresponds to the concordance. What it also means is that this is the Greek word that is used. And if you kind of look down, where you at, there's some other Greek words, I think, for law here. I don't see, but anyway, yeah. See, here's some other Greek words for law. Here's some other ones here. I don't know if you can see that. Okay. But what is the Greek word that is used in Romans 3? And again, I just want to, this is going to give us the gist of it. Then he says, while Numos became established name for law as decreed by the state and set up as the standard for the administration of justice. So law in general, expressing the general principle relating to law. Okay. So you kind of see there when he says law, okay, but now we know that whatever the law says. So now the law, any government usually will have some sort of law to rule it, because if you don't, you would have chaos. We wouldn't have society. What we're going to learn is that the law does not save, and the law does not provide a method to save. It just simply says, here is right and here is wrong. What Paul is getting ready to tell us here is that even though we have the law, our sin natures, we cannot keep the law. Now, when we go back to the law of Moses, so there were a couple of things about the law of Moses. So you have God delivering Israel. Up until that time, there was no law. There were laws and principles. In other words, there were rules and regulations that societies went by. But then you had Moses, who when God delivered them, they had no law. So was stealing wrong? What made stealing wrong? Because the law, God's law, said it was wrong. Now God's law goes a step further, even tells us why it's wrong. In other words, you think about just the 10 Commandments, and there were more than 10 commandments in the law. There's like 613 commandments. Now we use that kind of numbers to show you the vastness of the law, okay, broken down into, there was the ceremonial part for the priests, for the law, ceremonial part of how Israel was to worship God. And then there was the civil part, how they were to govern themselves. So the 10 Commandments basically had two parts to it. You can say one was the not the ceremonial part, but sort of the spiritual part, the worship part, which was put God first, have no other gods before me. And then you had the civil part of the law, which was thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods, thy neighbor's wife. So those kinds of commands, this is where God's law goes further than human law. Funny, today you have people that's trying to say, let's bring back the 10 Commandments. For what? Who are you going to bring them back for? I mean, seriously, if you say, let's bring the 10 Commandments back, you're not even living by the 10 Commandments. And so people want to bring back, in this sense, you hear this kind of language today about America coming back to God, as if America was ever in God. But we can go, again, we could just, the idea of the law, America violated its own law. Did it not? All men are created equal while having slaves. That gets to the whole point of the sin nature. But I'm jumping ahead. The law itself gives us the moral code, the right and wrong code. That's what the law does. When Moses gave those 10 Commandments, again, he gave more, they ultimately became the moral code, the moral right and wrong. Without it, you would never have known what is right and what is wrong. Without that law, you would have known that, as I said, stealing is wrong. Moses' law goes a step further and said, why is stealing wrong? Because it harms your brother. That's why it's wrong, because it harms your brother. So if you look at just the 10 Commandments, you have two things about the 10 Commandments. One violates God, offends God, and then the other offends your brother. So those are the two principles of law. So when God says, don't have any other gods before me, don't have any idols before me, Israel was plagued with that for the first, well, let me see. Well, anyway, about 2,000 years, something like that, until the Babylonian exile, 1,500 years maybe. No, not that long. But anyway, Israel kept falling into that. It kept falling into sin, kept falling into the sin. I'll get to that in a moment. But how do you know that they were sinning? Well, the law had to be the standard. God's law had to be the standard. It is the standard of right and wrong. Okay, so now what the law also did, that it incited, it brought forth our sinful nature, right? In other words, once you say, okay, thou shalt not, now I want to do it. My sin nature compels me, forces me. Now we saw that, remember, with Adam. God puts Adam in the garden and says, the garden is yours. All the trees, all of it's yours. You may eat of all of the trees in the garden, but the fruit that's in the tree of knowledge, don't eat of that. So what's the one he covered after? The one that God told him not to eat. That he made a choice to sin. I'm going to eat this fruit. God told me not to. I'm going to eat it. Despite the fact that he had every other tree, not only in the garden, but the entire world. But when God says don't eat that tree, now we see the temptation of sin, which I can understand with Adam. Us, we are products of that sin nature. We have sin natures. It's our nature to sin. Okay? Only hypocrites would try to say they don't sin. Because remember, let's say you could say, I've never killed anybody. I could tell you, I've never, ever, ever, ever killed anyone. I've never murdered anyone. There's unfortunately some people who do. I'm not one of them. Now, that doesn't mean I can't boast. Because as the scriptures tells us, if I hate my brother, I'm a murderer. See, God's standard goes a lot deeper than ours. While I may boast, I have never physically taken of life. But if I hate someone, I'm a murderer. Truthfully, I can't even tell you if I haven't even hated anybody. There's some people I dislike, but hate, I can't say that. But anyway, if I hate, he says, I'm a murderer. I can say, I've never committed adultery, never cheated on my wife. But you know what Jesus said? If you look upon a woman to lust after her, you've committed adultery in your heart. Wow, right? So that's God's standard. The law is what brings that to light. The law is the standard. It sets the standard. Right? It's not a sin to like apple pie. Right? It's not a sin to like ding dongs. Hostess apple pies. You probably can see where I'm going with this. But that's not a sin. Now, it may be a sin to be a glutton. It is a sin to be a glutton, but not a sin to like apple pies. It is a sin for me to covet, to want your apple pie. Now, that's the sin. Now, how do I know that? This is the standard that God says. Don't covet your neighbor's stuff, anything. Don't covet it. Don't covet it. So the law established that. The principle of the law established that. So he says, now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are subject to the law, which happens to be everyone. And then he says, so that every mouth may be shut, and that the whole world may become subject to God's judgment. So whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are subject to the law, so that every mouth may be shut. In other words, when no one. Now, there are some arrogance out there. There are some arrogant liars. Like I said, I can tell you I never committed a person, but can I tell you I've never hated anyone? I mean, truthfully, I don't think I can, but guess what? God may say, not so fast. Remember, have I ever committed adultery? No, but it's summertime. Have I lust after a woman? It's summertime. Jesus says what? Oh, you committed adultery there. Have I ever coveted someone's things? Yeah, I've coveted someone's things. I mean, oh man, that's a nice car you have. That's a nice whatever. I want that. Now I'm sinning. So guess what? Every mouth, notice the term here, every mouth may be shut. And then he says, and that the whole world may become subject to God's judgment. So now we come back to again, why do we need saving? Because everyone is subject to God's judgment. Everyone. Now, with that, let me read another verse of scripture here that let me read a scripture that I read a lot. So if I read this one a lot, but I think it's going to put something into perspective. So John, what the heck? John chapter 5. I'm all over the place here. All right, John chapter 5, verse 24. Now listen to this. This is Jesus speaking. I assure you, anyone who hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. Okay? Now remember I said before, remember we Pastor Sapp, that he's ignorant of this verse after being a pastor for 40 years, preaching, whatever. The sad thing is that I'm sure he's read this verse, but this word is not cognitive in his psyche, because he would never have made that statement that he has made understanding this verse. And again, I'm not just picking on only him. Most of Christianity falls in that same boat. Pastor Sapp said it, but most of Christianity teaches, they say it, teach it, and also believe it. He says, anyone who hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. Get this. And will not come under judgment. So how do we escape the judgment of God? See, but it's passed from death to life. Okay? So we know that the law, whatever the law says, it speaks to those that are subject to the law, so that every mouth may be shut and that the whole world may be subject to God's judgment. I don't care what denomination you're in. I don't care how you think of yourself. Your mouth will be closed, shut at God's justice. You are subject to God's judgment. Why? Because you are not good enough. You can never be good enough. You can never be good enough to satisfy God's judgment. Now look at verse 20. For no one will be justified in his sight by the works of the law, because the knowledge of sin comes through the law. Now remember, he says, now whatever the law says. Now he said no one will be justified by the law. Get this, in his sight, by the works of the law. Okay, now let's look up this word here. Let's look up works. Where is my... Let's look up works. Well, let's do this. Let's look at works and justify. You know what? Let me do this. Let me do works. I'm going to come back to justify probably next week. And let's look at works, though. Because we see this a lot. Okay, we see this a lot. Works. Working. Where is work? Okay, work. Here it is, right here. All right, so works. Okay, again, it's a going to be a long thing right here, but works. I should have looked at which one I want to look at. Oh, okay, the works of the law, because I want to look at a particular Greek word. So let me do this. Find the number here. Okay. So like I say, we're kind of doing a little study, and work. Wasn't there some kind of song? Work. Okay, anyway, I'm not doing that justice, so I'm going to stop. Work. There we go. Work. Here we go. Work. And then I'm thinking 2043 or 3043, 2040. Here we. Is that 2041? 2041. Can I find it here? 20. Where's 2041? By the works of the law, right? And am I using works or work? Yeah, works. Okay. Let me go back. Here we go. This is it. 2041. So this is the Greek word 2041. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Strong. 2041. And so deeds. That's why I kind of like this, because now you got to kind of get this down. And to say denotes works. Here we go. Business, performance. Okay. When did work? I'm not gonna go through all this because this is what I'm looking for. But then you see how our scholars break this down. Okay, so the idea of work is to perform, to do something. Okay. Um, so denotes work again, business. No, but that's not what I'm looking for. Okay. So the same. The idea of to work, to perform, to do something. Where is Romans at in here? Like I say, work. Notice it's work, employment, task. Okay, deed, acts, to act, to do something. So that's the gist right here. To work, to do something, right? For no one would be justified by his side by the works of the law. And if you know anything about the Pharisees, they were experts in the works of the law. Well, let me rephrase. They were experts, they were hypocrites. And the reason why is because they gave they gave the appearance that they were keeping all of the commandments of the law. Now that word keeping, again, to work. The idea is that when we say the works of the law, meaning to do all the commands. See, that's the idea, is to do all of the commands. Now, I'm going to come back later and show you. Well, I want to get to this word justify, but the problem, when he says justify, now I'm out of time, so I'm going to come back to this, but the idea of keeping the law, okay? If you're going to be justified by keeping the law. In other words, if you're going to be justified, and then you have to keep all of the law all the time perfectly. If you're going to be made right with God, you have to keep the law perfectly all the time. So we'll get into this next week. Again, flushing this out. Because if you think that your deeds, so I got baptized in water, that's a work. I joined the church. I quit smoking. I quit cursing. I quit doing this. See, those are works of the law, but they don't justify you in God's sight. All right, guys, I will pick this up next week where we left off, describing the legal, our receipts for salvation. All right, guys, don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought, a comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome, and I'll see you next Friday for our study through the book of Romans, verse by verse.